But there are visitors and
Yeah, they had to pick volleyball or swimming, because they made them at the same time
It's really nice.
for some reason.
Which ones?
So the other one's really Grand Tavern.
So they all went swimming instead of volleyball.
Peterman's, yes.
Oh, yeah. Now for a year and a half.
Yeah, I was not the first girl sworn.
That's where my hangout place is on Monday nights.
Oh, wow.
Peter was on Monday nights. My friend Dorothy, I used to go out with, we always hang out there on Monday nights.
Well, the choir used to be.
Oh, yeah, we did that on Wednesday.
You know,
After,
Was Boyle there then or not?
a couple of years ago, before COVID and all that,
Oh, yeah, sure.
choir used to meet there after,
Who was that other swim
well,
coach?
we had
We had
a
this
group
band.
that, Deb, led for the, lead service, lead thing.
Wow, he had the brand new pool.
We would break up about 6 of us, and we ended up over at Peterman's. And then the choir would come in about a half hour
Sure.
later after.
That diving well's different. Remember they had diving board at the boat
yeah,
land?
we had a party, we had a good,
That was.
we didn't get out there until probably 10 o'clock.
Yeah,
But they changed, I don't know where they changed.
later than 10 o'clock.
Oh, yeah.
That was
Probably.
hard to get the last year, and being still closed at 9 or at 10 o'clock.
But they do close at 8 o'clock now. After 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
They're going over there, about 12 o'clock till 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah,
Didn't
but
do
we,
well, I
you
should
know,
have done
the bar,
better.
yeah,
Thought about
Yeah.
open.
Car on the frame.
I was on.
In the afternoon, then you're on the frame.
earlier.
I believe.
yeah, and they never
And I got
started
one
into
point
another,
You are reporting.
I asked him if they were gonna extend their hours, and he said, no, they're not gonna extend their hours. Leave it at 12 o'clock, or 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah, I remember when, you know, girls, one of the girls was gonna relay at the end and they didn't get whatever.
Yeah,
So they blew the money, so they get that extra.
well, I
Yeah,
wonder
because
if
that's-
they used to have, you know,
The
their.
first relay that didn't get 4,
No,
no, so it was
right,
3,
advertising.
you know, not just one person.
Wednesday night, you could get 2.
Total team sport, yeah.
And man, we used to have a table for that.
What was your stroke?
And then.
Now they're not $10 or $12.
A couple trains, one train up to Denali.
And Monday nights, we used to have 2 for 1 on meatloaf or something like that.
Barb Gagnon was.
And then Tuesday would be like, about 2 for 1 on salads or something like that.
Yeah, every day they had a special.
The twin sister.
So do they have the same time specials now, or is that?
They went.
I think we changed it.
That changed, and all the prices went up, like I said, on the advertisers, they all went up from $10 a piece to 12. And then, like I said, on Wednesday, you could get 2 for the price of 2.
So they'll run the rental, that rental feeds into one of the school.
No, I got it. Yeah, thank you.
You were young.
The guy that owns that
They
place,
used
he
to
used to be a
youth group
chef at Peter, at Cowley's. And he started out at Cowley's, and then he opened up his own place.
Okay.
So Peterman's has probably been there 5 years, maybe.
Yeah.
They're relatively new.
Yeah, they do a really good business.
Yeah.
Would they still have them?
I mean, it's like, if you don't get there like 5:30, you'll have to wait for like at least a half hour or 20 minutes or so. Like,
And once in a while, they'll have entertainment.
yeah, on the weekends or something.
Well, we went there on Thursday night, and they have one
Oh,
on
really?
Thursday night.
How that last
Couple
year's
Okay.
property.
Okay,
Like,
that'd be cool. Sounds fun.
Yeah, the entertainment I've also enjoyed.
Pretty good group.
Feels like there's quite a bit.
Yeah.
And then
He's here in Michigan.
free.
This is Chris and
Grandkids and their mom.
Then on the last, we need a section that way for everyone to see if we
She likes to put them up for
Nice.
You know, they're interested, you know.
Yeah.
I know you said they talk almost every night.
Did Marge ever go?
Team all the way
I
to,
bet, or no?
you know.
Probably not.
And where's Chris?
Yeah.
Marge, Farquhar.
Marge Farquhar.
I just love the variety.
Do they still have a concert?
Yeah, that's kind of between.
She was,
I don't remember
Yeah,
hearing
they used to
anything
have
lately.
them. Oh, I haven't heard anything either, but I like to keep my ears open when it goes back. And I'd like to go back to concerts. Center too, I haven't been. Since COVID.
Well, Plastic Center's got a lot going on now.
Yeah, I know they do, and I would like to get back.
Well,
in.
Was it Heritage Park has concert on Thursday night or so?
They've had that for years,
Yeah.
for 20 years.
The Farmington Concert Band, they used to have, at least once a year they had something. My grandson was in that for a couple of years. And they would have it either Art in the Park, there along Nigger House, or in downtown.
Oh, yeah.
At least one a month.
I'm interested in is that art show, they said they transferred it to the fall.
Really?
I would like to go, or,
I didn't know about that.
oh yeah, I called
This
about
year
it.
we are because of
I
the
asked
last
the
year,
library.
the three couples
They
that were
couldn't
going
hurry,
out,
so
so
I
I can
called
friends,
the
so all of us
plastic
were like,
center,
okay,
they
we can't
said,
make it huge, because
They
we were
were
trying to say a couple
transferring
years
the
ago.
show, it used to be in the spring,
Yeah.
so
October. Quite that long.
I'd like to find
The
out
one
more
that's
about
in
it.
June on the
We're
street.
gonna go to Hocking Hills.
Is
Art?
that Art on the Grand? or
Art on the
whatever it is?
Grand.
No, that's not Art on the Grand, that's the art show at the Plastic Center, a smaller art show.
And,
Yeah.
The patrons of it go there.
Pinckney where Hell Creek Campground is,
Oh,
when I
yes.
go to Hell Creek Campground.
A lot of
Lake.
special work being done.
That's fine.
there.
Yeah, exactly. And it's
Yeah,
nice because our
stuff
one friend,
children even
sometimes
use
they
it,
get a lot of
high
time
school
off,
kids,
is a
all
finance
ages.
delivery guy.
When I went,
And so it's sometimes not too far that he can drive back and
it's
forth.
just been so long since I've been there, and I'd like to go back. Or submit something, I think it's pretty good, and I'd like to.
Was it State Park in the State Park in Grand Hills? Not too far.
I'm still gonna go to the concerts in downtown Parliament,
So when you're,
when they come out and,
Yeah,
like in the June, first week of July.
Oh, I went last year,
Oh, yeah.
I went to the farmers markets too, I like that.
there's pool.
Like those.
Would you like to find a winery or brewery to go to, like hard?
Do the same ones.
Year after
Campfire, you know, go to, all the dogs and go around.
I enjoy which ones I don't.
There's a husky, working, and then I too, and then
Yeah,
another
some
couple that
things
comes
you
with us,
have to
sometimes we
pass
have
by,
two
and other
large
things
things.
are
So we
worthwhile.
have quite a menagerie when we go walking through the
I
big
agree
house,
with
so-
you about some of
And
those
then we'll go sightseeing
concerts
sometimes.
they had last summer, farmers markets.
Yeah, we should. We have a,
remember when they had that fountain there in the middle of the parking lot?
we call it the.
And that's where they used to have
Memorial
all
Art Piece.
concerts.
We got it the year my
Yeah,
dad.
that was
a
great.
Yep.
I don't remember that.
Present to ourselves for that. We love it, but we're trying to sell it to get a different future.
I might have gone there with Nancy Eagle 10 years ago or so.
So fingers crossed.
Take me there.
Yeah, it's been a while, because
We can't, the one that I really
It
like
was-
was Travel Trailer.
yeah, I
which
think
I've
it
never-
was about
I
10
told
years
Papa,
ago.
I told him,
We had a summer, in our 10 or 11 years ago when I first moved.
and I was really nervous about travel trailers. That's the problem.
Oh,
There's
they
so much
sure
art
did.
now, they used to be,
At
that
nighttime,
it just
they
don't.
we saw Alexander Zonchek there one night.
Oh, I'd love to.
And it must have been 90 degrees
Oh, my.
temperature out there.
Wow.
By the
So
time
travel
he
trailers,
got
when
to
your car or
the
truck
He
is
was
stuck.
sweaty.
He was dripping wet, and you think he ran under a,
And I drove back a lot.
a
It
hose
was
or
easy,
something.
yeah.
And he got the biggest hand, I mean.
So our friends have the one where you
because,
like,
I mean,
and
the
it's
whole
just so
group of them. Alexander Zonchek is a local player.
It's like, we gotta sell the one we have.
And
Yeah.
he still plays around here sometimes.
And our friends, one of the friends we can't, but we.
I never forget that, we just sat there and every day.
I don't know, I think it's It's got an island in the middle of the kitchen, it's got.
I think he still plays down at the,
It's crazy.
downtown
It's
Detroit,
beautiful.
with the, when they have the concerts.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Is Baker's Keyboard Lounge still open? I think it
Yes,
was.
it is.
I think so, yeah.
I saw one that one
It's
day,
a
I
long
saw one.
time since I was there.
Yes, Randy loves
Really
that.
great
Yeah,
place.
that's still there.
It's
Wow.
hilarious, bigger dishes and oh my god. And then, did you ever see, R&B with Robin Williams?
No.
That's pretty cool.
That's some, maybe get some of that for here.
Oh, this was really good. Yeah. Thank you. Maybe the same.
There's the RV motorhome museum, like Hall of Fame Museum, and we've been there a couple times, it's very, when I used to travel for work, and I go to South End, one of our hospitals is every so all these old campers, from some people just, Airstreams and all kinds of really fun, look inside and see all the retro ones. Those are fun, oh yeah. Music.
Good evening, Larry.
Hello. How you doing?
I know it's good, but I don't know.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I,
I'm trying to think where it was. Not tonight, it was a banquet.
Okay.
Does anybody need anything more? I can refill a few things if anybody needs more.
No, it's very good.
Thank you. The meat was from Gordon Food Service, believe it or not.
Oh.
I used that for one of, it was Katie's grandparty, tacos.
Pre-cooked and there you go.
So we're, you know, it was like 90-some degrees that day, it was a big storm just before. We don't have air conditioning in our house, so we're already boiling the bags on the top of the stove. And I remembered
Somebody had there's good taco meat from there before, it was really good. Yeah, I heard 15 people, like you should eat brown hamburger and.
let's see what it's saying. Sorry, we're chatting about what TV you.
Well, I took the day out too, it was my friend's funeral,
So what did you do to love these teams? You know, like, when did you do that?
I think it's recyclable.
Recycle?
Yeah.
I just put it in my, dip home and
she's had cancer
Green
for
barrel.
just over a year.
Yeah, 'cause I don't think there's,
She was diagnosed in January of 22. And she had
Yeah.
very,
No.
prognosis, aggressive type of cancer.
Yeah.
Primary cardiac,
Yeah.
like ovarian cancer.
and we have a thing here
She
too.
knew, she knew her prognosis wasn't good. And her husband was living around with her, and had heart surgery in 2019.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
did fine with that, but what I didn't remember or didn't put together was that
Tonight.
in the 70s when he was a kid who had Hodgkin's, and they did massive revolution, which is what they did, and he was like one of the few people still alive. So he was kind of a unicorn.
I just remember Nancy, I just left my phone at home, didn't charge it or so. That's the same vibrating ring that I get at my phone.
You know.
I said, I don't have my
His heart
phone
is
here,
very
but my
brittle,
charge
and
me at my
Dr.
phone.
Morgan, so they kind of were prepared, but didn't expect it to happen.
Okay.
One is Hannah's
Okay.
age, she's, they grew up
So
together,
we'll do 5
and then,
Okay.
the other one is a sophomore. 25.
Thank you.
How they doing?
They're doing okay.
I know it's not.
I'm sure it'll hit them, you know, they gotta sell a house, 3 cars, all the stuff in it, you know, deal with all that. And one
Lots to think
just got
about.
married
I'll let you know when
in January, and they,
want me to do it.
you know, they got married kind of a really small, quick wedding.
Because I didn't really tell
They
her.
were thinking for their mom, and
So I
then
just
their
said
dad passed first.
we would have this
And,
impromptu conversation and then it led
Her
to.
husband, I was talking to him the other day, and he said, you know, he was calling the banks and trying to do all the paperwork, he goes, and some of these people act like this has never happened to you.
So,
all right.
Like,
Thank you.
you know, oh, I'm not sure how to do that, I'll have to go talk to my manager, you know, I'm like, you know how to go through this.
Do they have other family? Do they have aunts and uncles?
They do, I don't know how close they are.
All right, friends. Here we are at chapter 4. Just to give you a recap for those that are following along generally, maybe not word for word, the introduction just kind of went through this, here we are, post-COVID, well, not post-COVID, right? We're still in the midst of it, but post-2020 and the reality of COVID and how that has changed our lives, some for the better and some really not, not so much. And then chapter 1, just kind of going into really the origins of this kind of nightmare, and really thinking about how we can, I'm getting my chapter 2 stuff. What is the reality of the church? And then it's the origins of nightmare, sorry. The reality of the church in terms of decline and how COVID and other factors have contributed to church membership across Protestant denominations being in not only decline numerically, but decline in terms of church affiliation, churches closing in general, buildings being left vacant, and some leaving denominations. So not necessarily the church itself declining, but the institution of the church in decline. Then the second chapter was about more hope for beloved community. So now the church is changing, and yet there's still a hope for people that are like us, people of faith, to gather together and be inspired and be encouraged. What is the church, and how could the church be, and how can we be the church? And ultimately, she arrived at the definition of beloved community as one that's consistent enough throughout all of history to describe all the ways that we've always tried to gather and be, whether we call it the church or a community or a congregation or a family or a nation or a tribe, that all of history, people like us have continued and will continue to gather for the sake of being good and kind and helping each other and sustaining our resources and providing home and safety and security and flourishing, like base level. There will always be a need for beloved community. But then she went into talking about the origins of the nightmare, and painted the empire as the origin of the nightmare. And empire specifically meaning conquest, global travel for the purposes of gaining resources and economic wealth at the expense of other people groups. So not just the sake of the gain of wealth, but the gain at the expense of other people groups. And she labeled that as the origin of the nightmare. It's not enough to want to gain, but to gain at the expense of other people groups isn't the beloved community. It isn't what we would consider as being a loving action. That's in fact antithetical to everything that Jesus preached about. And so now this week, chapter 4, she talks about the church of the empire. And she talks about, and I'm grateful, because again, it's a challenging chapter to read in some regards, and I see Larry with this book on the table. Can you hold that up, Larry? Thank you, sir. White Too Long. This book, that book basically is this chapter, but extended.
It's the same thing, it's just much more specific and much more graphic.
Yeah.
And much more political.
Yeah.
You know, it's terrifying, it's a rough read.
Yeah. We had to read that book for graduate school, and you know, it's one on a list of several dozen books that we're supposed to read or reference for the semester. So I don't get to digest it, but I'm reading it going, wait a minute, this is just like ripping off the Band-Aid constantly, and then it's like, oh wait, there's another jab, rip off the Band-Aid, turn to the next page. And so this chapter was like a condensed version of that. because what it did was it brought up some very difficult truths for me as a Christian, first of all, then me as a Black person, then me as a male-bodied person, and then you fill in the blank. I just felt at the end of the chapter, or at the end of that book, that we're all, and this is where my sermon is titled, we're all ultimately responsible, all of us, like ultimately, because whether I'm a trans male participating in patriarchy or a Black person participating in capitalism, or, fill in the blank, ultimately we're all responsible. So she talks about the church of the empire from the Episcopal lens, which I was grateful for, because if she had kind of went in through the Congregationalist lens, I probably would have had to bring in some reinforcements and not be preaching on this chapter this Sunday. But she talked about how the Episcopal Church represents the top 2% of those in society. They hold the most wealth, they have the most education, and part of that can be traced throughout all of the American settlement in history, because the Episcopal Church was created as a reaction to the Church of England and America separating. So there had to become now a religion for Americans who still followed those same tenets, and instead of pledging allegiance in the Book of Common Prayer to, a monarchy, it had to change the language. And so there had to be an American Episcopal Church. Well, that American Episcopal Church still represented the top 2% of the population, even though there was a split between American British colonialism and then what became American colonialism. The Episcopal Church owned the most enslaved humans. They were oftentimes, their churches were built by enslaved people, and their churches' endowments were funded by inheriting enslaved people, and they could sell and trade those people and generate wealth for their congregations. And so she talked about how, for her, as an Episcopalian, I mean, she's a Black woman, she's married to a white man, and she's an Episcopal priest. Like, you gotta reconcile some stuff, right? But for her, she's saying even she can find responsibility in that system because of how she even now benefits from the wealth generated by those systems. And so she's not saying shame on every single Episcopalian, we should never hold our heads up high. What she was saying is we have to confront our history. We have to know why some people are legitimately angry. And we also have to know that while there are some people whose families didn't participate in enslavement, whose families were never, rewarded monies for scalping Native Americans, because entire populations were given deeds to land in exchange for scalps. And so that meant they had to kill people. And to embody that reality, some folks can say, well, my people, we didn't inherit land that way, or my parents or grandparents or great grandparents didn't participate in that. What she's saying is all of our parents and grandparents may not have participated in those systems. Some may have, and that's a different process of reconciliation and repair and acknowledgement. And for those who haven't, that we still are the recipients of those who did. And so for me, like, she went through just kind of the church and how there was a couple of churches, predominantly African-American churches, that labored for many, many years to have standing in the Episcopal Church. They weren't allowed to worship as Episcopalians in the white churches of the slave owners that owned them. So they had permission to gather and assemble as their own churches, but those churches were not given standing in the institution of the religious body that govern them. And so after many years of trying and, appealing, there was a church given, standing, and then she goes through the process of explaining how, but even after being given standing, churches still go through issues, and they still experience discrimination, and they still, have hardships. And so, making the distinction between in word and in deed, right? We say, we're anti-racist, or we're integrationist, or we believe in, all people having equality, and then we have to also name these very real places where inequality is real, all people aren't treated fairly, there is suffering in these ways, there is, there are Native American people alive whose ancestors were maimed and murdered in genocide, and they hold that with them. And it's not enough for us to have them hold that. There must be some sort of, not just acknowledgement, but repair. And so I'm brought to a place, I think it was, I won't share who, but I think it was in worship or right after worship last week, someone said, I just don't want to feel bad all the time. And I respect that statement, because this is the kind of chapter where if you didn't know the rest of history, you would be feeling bad all the time. Because how can we not? If we're truly people of God in the face of suffering, I don't know anybody who can truly rejoice when other people suffer. You might kind of, smirk if somebody speeds past you, and then all of a sudden you see them get pulled over by the cops. Like, I feel a little sense of redemption when I see that, but true suffering, I just feel like we all have compassion when we see true suffering, and we don't want to feel bad. And so what she's saying is, hi Alice, what she's saying is, none of us want to feel bad. So how do we get to a place where none of us feel bad all the time, whether that's through being oppressed and marginalized, or living from the effects of genocide and enslavement that haven't been reconciled or resolved or repaired, or living in the current consequence of, division and hierarchy and sexism and, religious persecution, and she goes into some of how even Christians, not just based on race or sex, but how Christians throughout all of history have gone into other countries and said, conform or die. And that death would be brutal, because we have agency from God to deliver justice as swift and as evil as we see fit, because you are a heathen and you don't do as our God says you ought to do. And that's a hard truth to hear. So after we, in this room, knowing what we know, coming to this space and this conversation with our own history, our own understanding of whether it's sexism or racism or classism or homophobia or all of the justice issues in the world, and even the personal ones, like the kids that have, that live in poverty, and parents are working multiple jobs, and it's not about race, it's just about where they're at, and they don't have access to a lot of resources or a lot of, fill in the blank. So what comes up for you when you hear and read and think about the church of the empire, and how we, whether it's the Episcopal Church or the UCC or the Congregationalists or the Baptists or the whoever, have been in some ways, and not all of the time, but in some ways complicit with the suffering that many people in the world experience.
That's tough to answer that question, because I really have no clue about that, because if people ask me at work, did you hear anything about what's going on at your church or anything like that, and I said, I haven't been to church for a while, so I don't know what's been going on at church.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, in reading this, I just kind of get so disgusted.
Mm.
You know, it's like, why would you want to be a Christian? It's just,
That's what I was thinking
you
too.
know.
Exactly,
then-
when I was
then-
reading that, thinking, wow,
Pardon me?
I was thinking the same thing as you're reading this, like, no wonder people leave the church, you know, when they see this. And that's, I mean, those are historical things, but still happening now.
There was something on this page, but, it's, they listed church first, then crown, then country. But if the crown was the head of the church and the head of the country, it all went back to authority, to the crown. So is that Christian? So it's so convoluted. Is that church when the crown oversees the church? And they were broke away from the Roman Catholics, which, that's a whole other issue. And I kept going, as I was reading, I kept going back to that. This is the stem of the problem.
Mm.
Because it should be Christ at the head
That's right.
and not the crown as the head. Although they say it's church. But the church oversaw, I mean, that the crown oversaw the church and the community, so it's. Then you can see where the problems came from.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking, you know, this background of ENR was a breakaway from Luther, the Lutheran church, and she stuck with the Episcopal church, and I'm sure if we followed that path,
Yeah.
I bet you there's some similarities there.
Oh, I'm willing to, that you're right, because the UCC is comprised of the top 10% of the population in terms of earners, people who are educated, where people live, and, I mean,
The UCC or
the
the
United Church of Christ, not the
Okay.
Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church is in the top 2%. But the UCC covers the top 10%, and I think it's because we do have some congregational, some ENR, you know, we have some folks that come from newly adopted traditions that have, like the Fellowship for Affirming Ministries. It's a group of that has been in existence for almost 40 years now, and they have 56 churches in countries all over the world. And they tend to be, you know, people that know more, have more knowledge, understand history, and not just one side, but have done extensive work to know that it's complicated. And most of the politicians are either Presbyterian, Congregationalist, or Episcopalian. And so then, you know, you think about the architects, if you will, of our society, the founding fathers, and it's to your point, Carolyn, these are the people that are the heads of state, and yet they're very closely connected to the church in ways that make it seem like instead of the church having power and influence over them, they have power and influence over the church.
Well, it shows me there's been a long history. It's just not today where the minority is trying to rule the majority, but it has been going on.
Yeah.
Since the beginning of our society here in the United States. That was not that they didn't know, but it was kind of an eye opener to me that it's, yeah, this is real. You know, we think these people came with a pure heart to have a great nation, and when they called it the New World, and I liked what they said here, no, it wasn't the New World. There was community here already in this country. But the people that lived here were squashed, they were murdered, they were
annihilated, I
And
believe.
annihilated, yeah.
It took I mean, you learn that in history, but as you're growing up, but you learn it from the Western European perspective. And it was all good to have a new world. And now I'm looking at it as it was not so good.
I'm thinking, I'm trying to remember which book talked about the true John Smith.
Oh, that's that,
That's,
yes.
yes, yeah, but, and, you know, and the mythology of John Smith and Pocahontas, and, you know, and the friendly
Romanticized
natives
the whole-
and, you know, and Thanksgiving and, you know, that whole business. And the reality, I wish I could find it in the book now, but I should have marked it. The reality was, John Smith was just as oppressive. And, you know, and even though the Indians did feed the initial colonists and everything, they were eventually attacked and murdered and,
Yeah, she talked about that.
yeah. You know,
Brian, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think chapter 4 is kind of a strong talking point for atheists or non-church going Christians, maybe.
Yeah, for sure.
that question I posed the first night, what, you know, what happened to our kids? We're raised in the church, but don't go to church now.
Can you say more about that?
Not really, only in the sense that I think Ashley definitely has a belief, but it came through, for her, I think it really came to a reality through AA. You know, and I haven't had the courage to broach the subject with Chris. So I don't know where their resistance to the church has come from. You know, his wife, Jacqueline, her family was strongly Catholic. Well, not her parents, but the grandmother is. There was a strong Catholic tradition there. And her parents were not particularly religious. They didn't follow it. And so I don't know if some of that comes from her, or, you know, where, you know more about Chris?
No.
Where's,
Not specifically why.
I think a lot of people just see the great hypocrisy in the church. And it's partly, I think, their perception. I think the perception is that people in the church are all holier than thou. And we will tell you what you should believe, what you should do. And yet we don't always do, we don't do what we preach necessarily. I mean, that is a perception. I think at least here at Salem, I think we recognize that we're here because we need to be here, and we're searching for how to be better people and doing more what God wants us to do. But I don't think that's the perception that the general public has. And I think that's what and as Brian said, that's the great argument for atheists or non-church going. It's just a bunch of people that think they're better than others.
Well, and then you got,
And how do we change that perception? I think is a big question for the church today.
and what do people hear in the media about what happens in the church?
right, it's, I mean, obviously the press sells all the
Right.
horrible things, which, I mean, those need to be brought to light, I'm not dismissing
Yeah.
that, but then you've got the He Gets Us campaign, you know, funded by, you know, the Hobby Lobby president and all the other people that are, have questionable motives, you know, that whole Super Bowl ad, and I'm sure a lot of our kids are looking at that going, are you kidding? Like, really?
You hear of all what's going on racially or, anyway, and you read that book and you see them putting it underneath the blanket of the church. And you think, what happened? You know, if anybody gets a load of anything, and like you said, it's your kids, they were brought up at a time when I don't think we were inundated by everything that was going on in the whole world. I wasn't when I was growing up, and my kids weren't when they were growing up. But it just seems maybe the younger ones now are they're so used to hearing all this stuff that it goes over their heads, where the older ones are thinking, well, what happened? You know, I was so happy and everything was so nice. When I was in church, and it was nice on Sunday morning, and my parents brought me on Sunday morning. But all of a sudden you think, well, what happened? You know, people woke up or whatever it was, and there was a light shined on troubles that were going on around, you know. I had 4 kids. My daughter married a Catholic man, and my other 3 wishy-washy, you know, they went here to church for several years, and the kids were baptized here, and then they moved away, and it was a little bit farther away to go. My other son, his wife they're members of the Northridge Church, which is, it's a city in its own. It's huge, you know, Northridge. And, is it called Northridge?
It is.
Yeah. I'm thinking of Old Point, it's over on 10 Mile Road. And, but they, you know, there are so many people and there are thousands. You have to find your own little niche. And they have. And they, you know, they really enjoy it. But my daughter-in-law is more of she's the one that's really the dynamic one between her son and her husband. I mean, they could probably maybe care less than, but she is so out there doing everything. And she's a trained clinical therapist. So she gets vibes from so many people that, you know. But it just said, I look at things when I was growing up and my kids were growing up, and I'm thinking, they didn't have all this stuff inundated on them day after day after day. Even if, like you said, the person said to you Sunday morning, I'm tired of being tired or whatever, angry or afraid.
Yeah.
That's all we hear, you know, and the church, I don't know if the church is big enough to handle all the things that's going on. you
Nancy,
know?
I'm struck by something you said, Nancy, about the bed, you know, like the covers. And just when you said that, it made me think, it's almost like the church has had this nicely made bed for so many years. It looks beautiful, it's all tucked in, we've got the matching pillow, and then somebody's been pulling back the sheets. And we see what was under there the whole time, right? Like what's been under the rug or under the bed. And it's been there the whole time. We just weren't awake. We've been woken up, right? And God forbid we say, but
Yeah,
it's truly, I mean, it was there. I don't think we saw it because of social media. And I think it's been amplified, right? You know, I mean, how many other generations had a kid, right? You know, go to an elementary school where there was a mass shooting, end up at a college where there's a shooting, or a high school, and in less than a year, another shooting. I mean, I think it's, you know, the light is shown on it, you're right, and we have to respond to it.
But are all churches pulling back the covers?
Probably not, oh no.
No, the UCC
And who's
is.
the bed partners,
Other-
we can take
other.
this analogy a long way, couldn't we?
But, you know, what I know of the more, what's the word, not evangelical, the fundamentalist churches, Those bed sheets and covers are pretty damn tight.
Yeah.
Very true.
That was the summer book in this stack here. There's a book about the evangelical church. And, it's called The Power Worshippers. I could not read it. I've read 2 chapters
But they have to be.
and they gave it to him.
So
This
they
is
have to
above
be
my-
in charge. of
Above my favorite.
Well, yeah, the worshiping, the title says it all. They worship power. And it was terrifying to read it. I just couldn't read it. I bought it at the same time I bought this one. I stopped reading that and didn't start reading this until we started doing this. I can tell you about the kids in this church, and our kids. At one point, I had them in Sunday school class. And they questioned everything. They were really searching.
But that's good. Because when I was
Yes.
in this church, we weren't to question, we were to sit and listen.
Hmm.
And this is what you're to do.
Brian, you look like you were gonna say something a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Instead of all the doom and gloom, how about that in Kentucky, that revival? How would you like to have a service for 2 weeks and nobody would leave? I mean, it's still out there.
I'm not aware of
It
that.
was in Kentucky, I believe, and the young people would even kick the old people out certain times because they had so many young people that wanted to get into the church. So, there's still a lot of people going to church, and it's not like everybody's bailing or,
And I think that's a great point to make. Where are people bailing and where are people running to? Where are people flocking to? And not just the conservative fundamentalists, but there are mega churches that are progressive and socially or, otherwise. And I think I have a friend, he's also a millennial pastor, but he's Lutheran. And he was just speaking in Minnesota and I saw it online on the live stream. And he said, I'm a church growth expert. If you want your church to grow, do not include gay people. Do not talk about equality of races or gender. Do not talk about anything socially progressive. Because people who want church somehow associate all of those conversations with either having to make a decision about something that they aren't either qualified to, or they don't feel like they are qualified to, or they just plain don't want to think about making this decision, or whoever is in charge of making those decisions, they trust that God has, or society has chosen this person or these people to make the decisions for them. And so it's easier to belong in spaces where there is the power, there are very visible systems and networks of power, where you know who controls the curriculum, who controls the money, who controls the calendar, who controls the flow of people, who controls who gets in, who controls who gets out, and who controls what the pastor preaches, who controls how many times Kathy can go on vacation. I mean, there's very clearly visible lines of power in these structures. And to some people, after a really crazy, unpredictable week, that's really attractive. Or for people that don't have a lot of stability in their own lives, that's really attractive. Going to the church where there's 90 different community groups and a whole building for children, and I don't have to think about my kid for 17 hours or however long it is, that's really attractive. And so I think, to your point, to many points, it's not all doom and gloom. It's the church that finds their niche and can either speak to that niche in a way that also educates people, or, to Amy's point, speak to a certain niche, but choose to keep the bed made in such a way that it doesn't reveal all of the bad stuff underneath. Because if it were to do that, it would take away from the power, and it would take away from the good, and it would diminish the capacity or the membership or the trust. I mean, you think about how many churches, after, and I can talk about Catholicism because many of you have brought up Catholicism. But in the 1960s, the Catholic Church was heralded very differently than the Catholic Church was in the 80s and 90s, when story after story was breaking of not just kids coming forward, but cover-ups that went for decades. Like, it's enough to say that a church could have been blind to, or, unable to see the terrible misdeeds of this person. But to say an entire institution, many bishops, many clerics helped this person navigate through a system and escape being charged, like that's a different kind of effort. And so when we think about that, there are still people who flock to Catholic churches and they know that happened. And it's not because they think, well, those kids didn't matter, or those churches, they'll get theirs. But it's easy enough to say, but there's still something in the system that I can hang my hat on, even if it's not the people. For me, the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism is the other way. There's still something about the people that I can hang my hat on. The system, I believe, for the Protestant church is corrupt, has been from the beginning. To many of your points, if the new world was to establish itself as one in a newly discovered world, that would be very different than the new world that just came about because it pretended that the current one and its people didn't exist. And yet, here we are, currently people who do exist, who see all of those things and can still make decisions to try to be better people and still try to care for the least of those among us. So for me, I'm a Protestant and not Catholic because I have more hope in the people than I do in the institution. And you all have shown again and again that you are the people, you are the church, you are the beloved community. And not just because we can talk about this stuff, but because you literally care about other people and you do it in so many ways. But you don't do that just because it feels good to you. There are some people who literally only come to church because it checks off a box and makes them feel or look good. And so how do we be the church here in this age, knowing what we know, given that there are many different religious groups, some thriving and some declining?
I had a brother-in-law in the 50s, because my father passed away when I was 10 years old, so he was almost like a father figure to me, because he was married to my sister, who was 12 years older than I am. And he ended up going into General Motors, and he was an executive. Well, there was a job open for him in the upper echelon at General Motors down in Detroit. And they told him, make sure you're affiliated with a church, not just the little one on the corner. So, but the thing is that he already was affiliated with a bigger church in Detroit, which is fine. But I can remember that they were telling him that you have to make sure that you get yourself. And he was in that church from the time he was married until, I don't know how long, maybe 15 years. He finally decided he was going to join the church. He hadn't been a member all that time. And then finally, they told him, this is something you have to be affiliated with, and he joined the church. I remember my sister telling me this, because I said to my sister, well, how come he's joining all of a sudden, after all these years? Came along, well, he got the job and all that, but fine, but, this was back in maybe 70s at the time then, than this was. I can remember that. And he, like you said, you walk in the door because this is where you should be on Sunday morning,
I think too, for me, it's, and I've always appreciated that about Salem through all of our pastors, I think, to one extent or another. There's a balance between being challenged and tested to grow in my own faith of not just blindly, listening and coming and, okay, that's what it says, blah, blah, but learning about the context of the scriptures and the time period, and what did that make sense, and what does that mean now? And still having hope, right? It is good news, technically, we're watching The Chosen right now on Netflix or whatever channel it's on. I'm really enjoying it as a Lent series to watch for some reason. I don't know, I just am really enjoying it, and seeing some of the struggles, the way the Jews were treated by the Romans and things like, okay, people have been horrible to each other since there was more than 2 of us on this planet, basically, right? And even then, it probably was a problem, but it just, it really reminds me, like, we need to pause and reflect and say, am I walking in the path that God or Christ would want me to? I can't redo the path that others did, and I can make sure I'm on a path. So I feel like I need both, I don't want to walk away being beaten up every Sunday.
Yeah.
And I know there was times where I felt that, here. And I don't even know always that it was felt beaten up because of my faith. It was just other kind of weird stuff that felt strange. But on the other hand, we have good news, and we're always supposed to be learning and watching the disciples in this show.
Yeah.
And the mistakes that they make. I'm like, yep, been there, done that, yep, and they're so human, it's like you just see how real, like, oh yeah, I could imagine people squabbling over who gets to, well, no, you go fish, I'm gonna go sit and listen to the teacher, it's just like, that's who we are, right? We're following, we're little Christs, we're trying to learn and grow and go in that direction, and some of that means reframing where we came from and figuring that out, and what do we do going forward to make it better. And not just laying in the bed and going, oh, it's so cozy.
Yeah. Thank you. Alex.
I wanted to talk about, excuse me, conversations in the hot tub.
Yes, I was gonna remind you of that. I thought that was personal, so I'm glad you brought it up in front of everybody.
Happy birthday to you. Let's hear that.
We get a group in the hot tub not every week, every day, but we get in that hot tub and we get conversations going. We have solved world problems, health problems. We have solved church problems. We had Muslims, we had Catholics, we have Jewish lady right from Israel. We have a white woman who's married to an Arab man or some nationality, so she wears the whole doodah, you know what they call it, and even in the hot tub, she can take all that off because it's all women, so she can take her hoodie off, and we get going on these long conversations there, and some of the stuff that we've been talking about, I've heard in the pool so many times. I was thinking, maybe what we ought to do is make this giant pool, put all the leaders in the pool and make them stay in there until they solve all the problems.
And turn it up.
Yeah, that's good.
So what's in the water?
Wow.
With the one lady that was Muslim by conversion, they lived in the South for a while, and it was like for black people, the police pull everybody over. Well, they pulled her over every day because she was white and had all this outfit on, and black kids in the back seat. And so she said what she did was she went to the police station and they gathered all the police and the department together, and she got up and spoke in front of them and told them who she was and why she dressed the way she was, and that, and the police kind of eased off and they quit pulling her over every day for no reason.
Wow. Thank you. I think it's very important that we realize, though, that everyone has different experiences. And so, you know, while, and I'm just gonna use myself as an example, while I might have wonderful, blissful, beloved memories of church, but that's not everybody's experience. Or if I have horrible, nightmarish memories of church and I hate everything church, that's also not everybody's experience. And what I love about having these kinds of conversations is that we realize that our experience gets changed a little bit when we hear how someone else experienced things, but that we don't need to change how we feel or think about church just because of someone else's experiences. Certainly, we're invited to care about people, but we don't have to walk away from our faith or abandon our Jesus because someone else has co-opted him and used his name in vain and done some really horrible things under the guise of his leadership and direction. And to Amy's point, we can reframe our history, and we also can reframe our faith and reframe how we look at what it means to be the church. You know, 100 years ago, to be the church was to be the community. You know, you were childcare, you were neighbors, you were the soup kitchen, you were each other's help and source of strength. And now, you know, you look at 50 years ago, church was more about belonging and social status and having like-minded people come together because of this thing. It was more of a social club that celebrated faith in Jesus and good works in the world, and took time to pray and read scripture and raise their kids, at least try to raise their kids as well as possible. And now you fast forward 50 years and church is a place or a group of people who recognize that there is opportunity in the world, opportunity to be like Jesus Christ. And sometimes that requires speaking truth to power. Sometimes that requires not saying anything at all. Sometimes that requires giving and giving of yourself. And sometimes that requires giving less of yourself and taking up less space and knowing when someone else might need a little bit more. And it's still evolving. You know, COVID has taught us nothing else. Everything is always going to be in flux and nothing is fixed. So the last question I guess I have is, as we go from this place, knowing that there's a difference between God and the people that are in churches, and that sometimes people do really terrible things, and that sometimes people do really wonderful and amazing things, how can we reframe our hope of what it means to be the church?
Say that last part again.
How can we reframe our hope of what it means to be the church?
Lead by example. I mean,
Have faith. Yeah, there's, something will happen all of a sudden, think, oh, that was pretty good, you know, or something like that. Yeah.
I think we have to be open to the leadings of the Spirit and willing to move in the direction we feel is the best to spread the good news into the community. I wish I knew how that was done, but
Well, I think you do it. I think we all do it to some degree every day by being a part of this community, because I mean, just by numbers alone, we're part of a movement by being in the UCC. So if we can have one garden, one building, and do, you know, a calendar of things, and then be connected to hundreds or thousands of other people who have similar resources or more to some degree, and sometimes less, what collectively can we do? And are we doing? If you add up all of the people who were fed, the houses that are built or rehabbed, all of the medical bills that are paid off, all of the charity and social work that's done to right the wrongs, I mean, like, we were talking about last week, people that are going in and buying up neighborhoods that were just abandoned and demolished or just terrorized, and turning those around and making those affordable housing for people that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford housing. I mean, those are ways, but those are not the only ways, right? Feeding programs, reading programs, scholarships, grants, and healthcare endowments. I mean, there's so many ways. And I think we're all doing, to some degree, because of our affiliation here, we're all doing our part. I mean, of course, we all could be doing more. I say that about myself too. Every day I wake up, and if I'm not in my metaphorical hot tub solving the problems of the world, I feel like I'm a terrible person, like wasting space on the planet. Oh God, why am I here? And then there's some days where I'm like, I'm done for the day. I can't do anything more, and it's okay.
And then give each other the grace to have those days where I need a break. I can't.
That's
Somebody
right.
else picks it up, right? That's when. One
See, Bob was working in Baltimore for quite a while, in this new city that they just started there. And they built one building for religious services, and all the religions met there at one time.
Wow.
And when the building wasn't being used for a religious service, it was used for office space, and it was in constant use. It was not sitting empty all day. Yeah. I thought that was a neat concept too.
This is relevant anymore. Someone told me once, when you're on a board, there's typically an odd number, so that, you know, you never get, you know, it's like having the vice president be the tiebreaker. So just, it would be wise to have an even number, and not leave the room until you reach consensus.
But look at the jury, though, that's not an odd number.
They have to reach consensus, don't they?
Well, we can't leave the hot tub until we reach consensus.
Once you wrinkled all up.
Maybe we should start calling these hot tub Wednesdays. But everyone comes fully clothed. Yeah, who's gonna show up?
Yes, please. Oh, that's fantastic. There's this,
We had one of the girls that came to our church, and I don't know how many of you remember, Anita, she did a yoga class here. And she did yoga all the time. She was real good at it. And she was a Montessori teacher. Brought the little kids right on up to how to do the yoga moves. She had never been in a Christian church before. She was Muslim. And she was fascinated. She wanted to see the whole building. So I took her on a grand tour, showed her the old German Bible, and she was amazed that this kind of building existed. And she was not a practicing Muslim either. But her husband, he was a professor at U of M, taught in oh, I forget what he taught, but what was I gonna say? Anyway, her kids moved to Maryland, her she followed them out there, so she hasn't been around, but I still get pictures of her she sends from India, or she wasn't from India, she was from Nepal.
Mm.
And, or I was gonna say her husband was with the doctors in foreign countries. He did that in the summer when he was off of classes at U of M.
So here we are, at the end of chapter 4. And and we're also halfway through the book. And so, that's really heartening because there is hope. There is an opportunity. And I don't think that we have even come close to realizing the power of God in us as the church. Even though we've done over the last several thousands of years a lot of good and a lot of bad, I still think there's a lot more that we just can't even conceive of. And so I don't believe the church is limited by anything except itself, because as long as we have God, anything is possible. Love, reconciliation, peace, generative living and learning, and conversations like this. And no, we might not be on separate sides of, division or arguments, and, this kind of conversation is a little easier to have because we know each other, and we have food, and, we're coming together. But imagine how we could just leave this place and share the same energy that we have here with other people who might not have access to spaces like this. Thank
We
you.
should invite some Muslims to come and see what our Christian church looks like.
Yeah, and during Ramadan, we can go to an iftar as a group from the church and go visit some Muslim communities. And I feel like go back and forth. I mean, whether it's Muslim or Jewish, or Hindu, or to Brian's point, atheists. There's people groups that we have a lot in common with. And if we could just come together and have some conversations, we learn a lot. So, but are there any comments or last minute things that people want to share as we conclude our discussion this evening?
Looking for the next chapter, Shards of Light.
Yes. And thank you again, Amy, for doing this. Really good. Next week, we have our dinner host.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Rick. And then following that, we have Carolyn. Thank you so much for hosting.
And
And
Nancy has agreed to do
I'm bringing
desserts there.
dessert.
oh,
She's
thank
gonna
you,
bring
Nancy. Oh, that's gonna be wonderful. Well, thank you
I
so
told her, I
much.
says, all the way here from my place, I kept thinking, I gotta get involved with one of those dinners, or I don't know how I'm gonna do it.
Oh, well, thank you.
She invited me.
Well, thank you all, and peace to you. I hope that the rest of your day, evening is warm and blessed and comfortable and as you need it to be. I look forward to getting a couple more of these mint Oreos.
It's always good for the chocolate.
Yeah, that's important.
Well, you gotta get it where you can, right?
Yeah, wherever you can get it.